Thank you for the introduction. So I want to first start by talking a little about why we participated in the challenge. So a belief that is shared by a lot of people in this room is that, and we really strongly believe in that, is that deep neural networks provide us a computational language to form these hypotheses about different brain mechanisms. These hypotheses could differ in their architecture, in their diet of the data that they get, in their learning objectives. But in order to really extract insights from these models, we need robust ways to compare them with brain activity, with behavioral data, in order to really adjudicate among them. Now, Algonauts provides this opportunity to take out a really strong bias out of our modeling practice, which is accessing the test data. By withholding that test data, you really prevent this bias to creep into your analysis. Also, the reason we participate is that because the development kit, the tutorials, the different videos that they were made were very well put together. Like, it really made it very easy. So I recommend to people to really check out the tutorials, even if you're not interested in the challenge itself. Yeah, for these reasons, we participated, and we think this is an important initiative. So to our approach, there is a recipe for predicting neural activity, which is, well, you have an image or other sensory modality, you convert that, you encode that in certain features, then you take those features and you map them to fMRI or other neural activity. Now, it stands to reason that what you use to encode would be the best performing computer science model. It would be CNNs or transformers or an ensemble of models. However, these are large dimensional networks with a lot of features. So a lot of people would use PCA or other approaches to reduce the dimensionality. Then you would train a regression on top of that and get neural activity. We are using also a transformer encoder for encoding the features. But the area that is a little underexplored is this mapping between features and neural activity, right? Instead of regression, can we explore other ways to do this, and can we actually learn that mapping? This seems to be the right time to do it because of the availability of larger scale data, including NSC data set, which Algonauts is based on. So first with the encoder, we used a vision transformer, a VIT, and just to refresh your memories, shown on the right. An image is divided into patches. Different patches are encoded with feature representation, and over multiple layers of encoding, each patch is contextualizing its response by attending to all the other patches that it finds relevant. And that's what's called self-attention. You could train such a model for classification, but you could also train such a model with self-supervised for reconstruction, for distillation, for other purposes. And what we use is a model called Dino, which is distillation with no labels. And in this model, you basically have different variations of the same image, and you want to make sure they have the same representation. So that allows the model, kind of forces the model to capture the essence of the image. So it's self-supervised. The reason we selected this backbone is because in earlier work, we were modeling the dynamics of object grouping, and we created this construct called affinity maps, which basically looks at the activity, the representation of one patch, and compares it with all the other patches. And we wanted to say, okay, a good representation should be object-centric, meaning that patches that have similar representation should be on the same object. And we basically compared a lot of models. What we found was that Dino version 2, which is a variation on Dino, with a VIT-based model, which is a 12-layer encoder, and patch size of 14 works best. So that is our backbone. On the decoder side, right, mapping these representations to fMRI activity, we are taking inspiration from a model called DETR. And in this model, basically, it's trained for object detection. So on the decoder side, you basically have different queries. In this case, they represent different objects. And they're learnable embeddings. They could specialize in detecting maybe large objects or objects that are in a corner or specific things. And they attend to different parts of through this key query mechanism, they attend to different parts of the encoder in order to basically detect a certain object. Putting all of this together, we could get a model like this, where we basically have an image, we divide it into patches, and if you need, you have to pad it a little bit so it fits the patch sizes. We feed these image patches, we go through many layers or multiple layers of the encoder, in this case is 12. We could get the visual input from one of these encoder layers, which is, say, about 31 by 31. These are the number of patches. And the feature dimension of each patch is around 768 in this case. You feed that to the decoder. On the decoder side, you use queries that correspond to different brain areas, to different regions of interest that you're interested to predict. And that query basically attends to the visual features it finds relevant. Then that is linearly mapped onto the visual representation of that specific area. Here, we decided to have models taking input from different layers of the encoder. But why would we want that? Theoretically, we would have expected that if the input comes from earlier layers of the encoder, it would be better for the decoder to be able to predict early visual areas, because we expected this hierarchy of representation kind of map. And this is exactly what we found. Here I'm showing the best model performance, like which encoder layer was used, their representation, in order to predict each of them. And you could see these are the posterior view of the brain. And you could see there is this gradedness, that the decoder can predict the voxel better if it's looking in the early visual areas, if it's looking at the early layers of the encoder. So we see this graded abstraction of representation in our encoder. So we basically combine the responses from these different models. We also have a post-processing step where we try to reduce the dimensionality and try to basically take advantage of dependencies among the voxels. And we add a little behavioral responses here. These aren't core to our model. We just added it at the end to get a little bit boost. But look at the code if you're interested. Now, putting it all together, and this is the courtesy of the organizers actually generating this, we get a score of around 63.5, and this is the view based on the performance. We didn't use any sorts of dependencies in terms of time and whatnot, but it would be interesting to also look at those factors. If we look at them, would we be able to improve our performance or not? Now, having told you this story, so I want to tell you, what do we gain when we go from regression to these sorts of transformer-based mapping from representation to the visual, to the fMRI activity? And what we can get actually are attention maps, right? Just to refresh your memory, this is the multi-head attention basically is attending each query, basically each regions of interest. You have a query, and it's attending to different parts of the visual encoder in order to predict the response. So now we could actually plot those attention maps. This shows the attention weights from a query that was predicting the V1V on the left hemisphere. So what would it attend to? Well, in this case, it's attending to this quadrant of the visual input. This is remarkable. We did not do any receptive field mapping in this model. This is all data-driven. The fact that this query eventually has to predict the brain activity of this area makes it basically attend to this part of the visual input. Let's look at some face-selective regions. Similarly, we see that when queries are basically trained to only predict certain face-selective areas, the attention emerges looking at the face in the image. Again, no, we're not doing any receptive field mapping or anything. We could look at body-selective areas and see what the attention signal is there. Or we could look at the place-selective areas and we see attention is more distributed that way. We could look at other face examples, and you could see it even works for animal faces or person face above. Even though there are much more salient stuff in these scenes, you could see that a query that is supposed to predict the FFA1 or FFA2 is attending to this specific region of the image, which we find remarkable because, again, no mapping. Like, it gives us the idea that maybe we could do this in a data-driven way. If you define an anatomical area and then train this model, you could see which area this query attended to and find the selectivity of that anatomical area. So transformers in this work help us in 3 ways. One, encoding. We believe that transformers that are trained with self-supervised objectives deserve consideration as models of visual representation in the brain. And we approach this both in this case with the neural data, but in prior work in terms of grouping and attention. Mapping to brain activity. We think transformers, aside from working better, they could give us a more elegant way of going from neural activity, from features to neural activity. And as I showed, they really increase the interpretability and in a way that they allow us to discover selectivity in a data-driven manner, in a way that, well, if I have an anatomical area, then I could potentially find out what concepts are maximally activating this area. Now, for future direction, I think we need more data. I think NSD is a great starting point, but I think it would be nice to have 10 or 50 folds more data in order to train these models and have many more layers. And in a way, if we really want to take advantage of the data-driven approach, I think we should have more data. We should try different backbones. I think we tried self-supervised one, but we could also try vision language aligned ones. I think those are also strong backbones. We should better quantify the segmentation, using segmentation maps, quantify this attention and see what the selectivity is. And I'll leave you with one last thought. Maybe the way we think about areas of the brain communicating, we could update that to think about maybe an area has this gated way of communicating with other cells in a way that the encoder and decoder are communicating here. But that's just a thought and very forward-looking. But I think it's an interesting thought to have. With that, I thank you and my collaborators.
Great, thank you. Any questions?
Yeah. Yep. Hello. So do you think which of the parts of the VIT, for example, is the architecture more important, or is the self-supervised losses that is trying to predict obscured patches, coloring, and that is more important for it to learn more important representations? So is the loss function more important, or have you tried, or the architecture more salient?
So we tried this with different. So if we, let's say, change the objective instead of, in this case, being distillation with reconstruction, we would get similar input. I think as long as it's a self-supervised thing, like in supervision, as we know, kind of abstracts over a lot of representation. But when you use self-supervised or unsupervised methods, whatever you want to call it, they maintain a lot more of the information. If you need to reconstruct the object, then you would have to maintain the information. Architecture is very important. I think what we saw in prior work, the transformer-based architecture works a lot better with, say, self-supervised methods than a convolution does. So it's just all sorts of things have to come together for it to give you this nice object-centric representation that could eventually give you better prediction power.
Thanks, great talk. Do you have a sense of what scale of data you need for the transformer mapping to be successful? Like with a run-of-the-mill cognitive neuroscience experiment, would that work?
Probably not. I mean, so we are training these models per subject. Mm-hmm. So in this case, we have around 9,000 images for each subject, and we have the data for them. I would say, and again, we had to simplify our model a lot in terms of even for that data set. So I would say you probably need that scale of images. But with the other project that I was talking about earlier, there we're not training beyond the initial point. So I think if you start from a pre-trained transformer, it gives you enough features that you could come up with a creative way of using it without retraining. In this case, we trained the decoder on the data. So.
But in that case, would you still be able to get those attention maps?
Probably not, yeah. So in that case, you probably would want, because the decoder, so you have to train a decoder in order to attend to the right way, yeah.
Okay, very cool work, thank you.
Thanks.
Sorry, I have one more question. So if I understand correctly, your model has one branch for each ROI, and they do not overlap. What do you think will happen if you had, if your linear layer were to predict vertices that overlap between ROIs?
So there are different ways of defining the queries. If we do, for example, streams, so you could have for different streams and stuff, they would overlap a little bit. But we haven't tried really overlapping and stuff, but I know what you, so that's an interesting point. We haven't tried that.
Because you would end up with some sort of like ensemble model in the sense that you would have several predictions maybe for voxels which overlap between, and I was just surprised, like I was just wondering what happens at the intersection of ROIs maybe.
That's interesting, we haven't looked at it. Cool.
Great, let's give one last round of applause for Hossein.